Myanmar earthquake. On March 28, 2025, a powerful 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck Myanmar, centered in the Sagaing region near the city of Mandalay. It was the strongest earthquake to hit Myanmar since 1912 and the second deadliest in the country's modern history. The disaster was triggered by a sudden movement along the Sagaing Fault, a major crack in the Earth's surface known for frequent earthquakes. The earthquake struck at 12:50 p.m. and caused extensive damage across Myanmar. Thousands of homes, temples, mosques, and historical monuments collapsed. Roads cracked severely, bridges gave way, and widespread landslides buried entire villages. Over 5,400 people lost their lives, while more than 11,000 others were injured, with hundreds more reported missing. Rescue efforts began quickly, but ongoing civil conflict severely limited emergency aid and evacuation efforts, even though a temporary ceasefire was agreed to help survivors. Many victims were trapped for days, and limited resources meant that some people who might have survived eventually perished under the rubble. In neighboring Thailand, buildings were damaged as well. A still under construction building intended for the State Audit Office fell down in Bangkok, resulting in at least 62 confirmed deaths, 19 injuries, and 32 individuals reported missing. Hundreds of homes were also damaged in Yunnan, China, while more than 400 apartments were affected in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Yogyakarta earthquake. On May 27, 2006, a sudden movement along a local fault line near the Opak River caused a powerful earthquake near Yogyakarta, a city on the island of Java in Indonesia. The ground shook violently for about 1 minute, with 154,000 houses destroyed and 260,000 more damaged. It became one of the most costly natural disasters of the previous decade. In total, 11 densely populated districts comprising 8.3 million people were affected. More than 5,700 people were killed and tens of thousands were injured. Hospitals were overwhelmed and many survivors had to be treated outdoors due to building damage. Rescue efforts began quickly, but were hampered by debris and limited resources. Makeshift shelters were set up across Yogyakarta for thousands of homeless people. Total financial losses were estimated at $3.1 billion, with 90% of the damage affecting private homes and businesses, similar to the destruction seen after the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. Many countries and organizations offered foreign aid to support the devastated region. The earthquake led to a rise in health problems caused by poor sanitation in temporary camps, widespread economic hardship, and renewed efforts to improve Indonesia's disaster management policies and building standards. Typhoon Haiyan, locally known as Yolanda, struck the central Philippines on November 8, 2013. It formed from a low-pressure area east-southeast of Pohnpei on November 2nd and quickly intensified into a Category 5 super typhoon. The Philippine government acted promptly by canceling classes and evacuating residents in flood and landslide-prone areas. However, the destruction left by the storm was significant and described as tsunami-like. The typhoon first made landfall in eastern Samar and Leyte provinces, bringing powerful winds of around 195 miles per hour, heavy rain, and a massive storm surge up to 20 feet high. Leyte Island and Tacloban City were the hardest hit, with houses almost completely flattened. Buildings were torn apart, power and communication lines were destroyed, and coastal areas were submerged. According to official United Nations reports, approximately 11 million people were affected, many of whom were left homeless. Initial economic losses were estimated at around $14 billion. Haiyan was considered the deadliest typhoon in modern Philippine history. Over 6,300 people lost their lives, with thousands more injured or missing. Rescue efforts were delayed due to blocked roads and damaged airports. Emergency shelters were overwhelmed, and many survivors struggled with shortages of food, clean water, and medical supplies. The storm also devastated other parts of Asia, including Vietnam, China. Nepal earthquake. On April 25, 2015, a massive earthquake occurred in Nepal, with its epicenter near Barpak village in the Gorkha district, about 80 kilometers northwest of Kathmandu. It was the worst natural disaster to strike Nepal since the 1934 Nepal-India earthquake. In 2013, a seismologist named Vinod Kumar Gaur had warned that a major earthquake could possibly happen sometime this century in Nepal, but some government officials ignored warnings and no preparations were made. The earthquake, measured at 7.8 magnitude, shook the region violently for nearly a minute. Ancient temples, residential buildings, and entire villages collapsed. In Kathmandu, historic sites like Durbar Square and the iconic Darahara Tower crumbled, trapping many people beneath the rubble. Avalanches were triggered on Mount Everest, killing at least 22 climbers at base camp. Another massive avalanche struck the Langtang Valley, where around 250 people were reported missing. Across Nepal, over 8,800 people lost their lives, and more than 22,000 were injured. Tens of thousands of homes were destroyed, leaving millions without shelter. Continued aftershocks occurred throughout Nepal at intervals of 15 to 20 minutes. International teams, including military units and medical crews, rushed to assist, but many survivors in remote villages had to wait days for help to arrive. The disaster caused up to $10 billion in damages, nearly half of the country's total GDP. Key industries like tourism collapsed as historic temples and landmarks were reduced to rubble. Farms were destroyed, and food production dropped sharply, leaving rural families struggling to survive. Reconstruction efforts moved slowly, and Nepal became heavily dependent on international aid. Many survivors faced long-term mental health trauma. In remote areas, clean water, food, and medical supplies remained scarce long after the earthquake. Gujarat earthquake. On January 26, 2001, while many people gathered for Republic Day parade in some districts of Gujarat, India, a sudden and powerful earthquake occurred with its epicenter near the town of Bhuj. Gujarat is home to around 50 million people at the time and India's fifth largest state by area. The earthquake, measuring 7.7 in magnitude, unleashed violent tremors across the state. Historic towns like Bhuj, Anjar, and Bhachau were devastated. Temples crumbled, hospitals collapsed, and entire neighborhoods were flattened within seconds. The dry, flat land and loose soil in the Kutch region worsened the shaking, causing deep cracks in the ground and making buildings even more unstable. More than 20,000 people died, over 150,000 were injured, and millions were left homeless. Over 100 aftershocks exceeding magnitude 4.0 struck some areas, and fires broke out in several towns, adding even more tragedy to this horrible disaster. In the countryside, fields split open, and some river paths shifted permanently. The destruction crippled Gujarat's economy, wiping out farms, factories, and small businesses. In the aftermath, reconstruction took years. Stricter building codes were introduced, and disaster response systems were strengthened across India. But for many survivors, recovery was slow, and the scars of the tragedy remain. The 2001 Gujarat earthquake stands as one of the deadliest and most devastating disasters in modern Indian history, a lasting reminder of the power of nature. Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. On March 11, 2011, a powerful earthquake struck off the coast of Tohoku in northeastern Japan. The earthquake, measuring 9.0 in magnitude, was the strongest ever recorded in Japan's history. Scientists had warned for years that this region was vulnerable, but no one imagined a disaster of such scale. Within 6 minutes, buildings swayed in Tokyo, hundreds of kilometers away. However, the true devastation came from the tsunami that followed. Walls of water up to 40 meters high crashed onto the coast, sweeping away entire towns like Rikuzentakata, Minami Sanriku, and parts of Sendai. The shallow continental shelf and funnel-like bays along the coastline magnified the tsunami's force, making the flooding even worse. In many areas, people had less than 10 minutes to escape. Over 19,000 people lost their lives, with many more injured or missing. Millions were left homeless. Another major tragedy was the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Flooding disabled the cooling systems of 3 reactors, causing meltdowns and releasing radiation into the environment. Around 470,000 people were forced to evacuate their homes. Rescue efforts were swift, but extremely difficult due to the wreckage, severe cold weather, and fears of radiation exposure. The disaster caused global shock and highlighted the need for stronger tsunami defenses, better evacuation plans, and stricter nuclear safety rules. Japan rebuilt many coastal towns with higher seawalls and improved warning systems. Strict new regulations were introduced for nuclear safety. The estimated economic damages exceeded $300 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in modern history. European heat waves. In June 2022, Europe faced one of the most intense and widespread heat waves in its recorded history. The heat wave began in Spain and Portugal around June 12th, before spreading across France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and much of Western Europe. Scientists pointed to climate change as the primary cause, as rising global temperatures made extreme heat events more frequent and severe. Wildfires erupted across Spain, France, and Portugal, destroying thousands of hectares of forest and forcing mass evacuations. Rail services were disrupted, airports faced delays, and roads buckled under the heat, overwhelming hospitals and emergency services. Across Europe, more than 20,000 excess deaths were recorded during the summer, with elderly people and those with pre-existing conditions most affected. Hospitals struggled to cope with heat stroke victims. Rescue efforts included setting up cooling centers, issuing public health warnings, and deploying firefighting crews from across the continent. However, emergency services were quickly overwhelmed, especially as multiple countries faced simultaneous crises. Power grids struggled to handle increased demand for air conditioning, and water shortages became a growing concern. In the aftermath, many governments called for stronger climate action, better urban planning, and new infrastructure capable of withstanding extreme heat. Turkey-Syria earthquakes. A powerful earthquake struck near Gaziantep, Turkey, close to the border with Syria, on February 6, 2023, at 4:17 a.m. local time. The quake measured 7.8 in magnitude, shaking the ground violently for almost 2 minutes. Entire neighborhoods collapsed. High-rise apartments, hospitals, historic mosques, and government buildings crumbled into piles of dust. A second major quake, nearly as strong, hit hours later, deepening the devastation. The mountainous landscape triggered deadly landslides, blocked roads, and isolated towns. Freezing winter weather made survival even harder. More than 59,000 people lost their lives across Turkey and Syria. Tens of thousands were injured, and millions were left homeless. Volunteers and international teams rushed in, but time was against them. Many victims remained trapped for days under the rubble. The long-term aftermath was severe. Economies were shattered. Historic sites were lost forever. Public anger grew over poor building standards and delayed government responses. Massive rebuilding programs began, but recovery was expected to take years. The 2023 Turkey-Syria earthquakes was considered one of the deadliest and most devastating disasters of the 21st century. Kashmir earthquake. A devastating earthquake occurred near Muzaffarabad in the Pakistan-administered region of Kashmir at 8:50 a.m. local time on October 8, 2005. This area, known for its steep mountains and political tensions, was home to remote villages and crowded towns built along unstable hillsides. The earthquake measured 7.6 in magnitude and lasted less than a minute, but the destruction it caused was massive. It hit during a school day, leading to the deaths of thousands of children trapped inside poorly constructed school buildings. Entire villages disappeared as landslides buried homes and blocked vital roads like the Karakoram Highway. Some places remained cut off for weeks. Survivors often had no choice but to dig through rubble with bare hands, waiting days before rescuers could reach them. Freezing temperatures in the mountainous region made conditions worse, with many left without shelter against the cold. Over 86,000 people were killed, more than 75,000 were injured, and about 3.5 million were displaced. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed local authorities. Temporary camps quickly became overcrowded, and diseases like cholera and pneumonia spread fast. Despite long-standing conflicts over Kashmir, both sides agreed to open some border crossings to allow aid and families to reunite. Reconstruction efforts were slow and difficult due to harsh terrain and lingering political sensitivities. Many survivors lived in tents for months or even years. Even today, the scars of that day are visible in the rebuilt cities, abandoned villages, and the memories of those who endured one of the deadliest earthquakes in South Asian history. Haiti earthquake. On January 12, 2010, at 4:53 p.m. local time, a catastrophic earthquake hit near Léogâne, just 25 kilometers west of Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti. The earthquake measured 7.0 in magnitude, but caused destruction far beyond its size. Poor building standards and overcrowded neighborhoods made the capital especially vulnerable. In seconds, homes, schools, hospitals, and even the presidential palace crumbled into rubble. Entire districts like Carrefour and Pétionville were flattened. The shaking turned streets into debris fields, trapping thousands. Landslides on the surrounding hills worsened the damage, cutting off access routes for rescue teams. Over 220,000 people lost their lives. More than 300,000 were injured, and around 1.5 million were left homeless. Haiti's government itself was crippled, with many officials dead or missing. International aid poured in, but damaged ports, broken airports, and blocked roads delayed deliveries. Survivors faced days without food, water, or medical care. Makeshift camps grew rapidly, and unsanitary conditions led to deadly cholera outbreaks just months later, killing thousands more. The earthquake's impact was especially severe because it devastated the heart of Haiti's social and economic life. Essential services collapsed almost overnight. Long-term recovery was slow and painful. Billions in aid were pledged, but much of it was delayed or mismanaged. Even 5 years later, many Haitians still lived in temporary shelters. The 2010 Haiti earthquake became one of the deadliest and most devastating disasters in modern history. Cyclone Nargis. On May 2, 2008, Cyclone Nargis made landfall in the Irrawaddy Delta of Myanmar at around 7 p.m. local time. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, carried a deep cultural history but was then ruled by a strict military government, isolated from much of the world. When Cyclone Nargis approached, early warnings were issued by international agencies, but Myanmar's government downplayed the danger and failed to evacuate people in time. The cyclone brought winds over 215 kilometers per hour and a storm surge as high as 3.5 meters. The flat, low-lying Irrawaddy Delta was especially vulnerable. Villages were submerged within hours. Wooden homes, rice paddies, schools, and monasteries were washed away. Entire towns like Bogale and Labuda were nearly wiped off the map. Over 138,000 people were killed, and millions were left homeless. The military government at first refused most international aid and restricted access to foreign workers. Survivors had to fend for themselves for days, facing hunger, disease, and contaminated water. The disaster highlighted the deadly cost of isolationism and poor governance. In the long term, Myanmar's economy, especially its vital rice production, was crippled. Entire communities were permanently displaced. Cyclone Nargis remains one of the deadliest tropical cyclones ever recorded in the Indian Ocean, a grim reminder that human inaction can make a natural disaster far worse. Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. On December 26, 2004, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded shook the seafloor off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. This region sits along a dangerous seismic zone called the Ring of Fire. The earthquake measured 9.1 in magnitude and lasted more than 10 minutes, releasing energy equal to hundreds of atomic bombs. It ruptured a huge stretch of the ocean floor, lifting the seabed and displacing massive amounts of water. Minutes later, a series of giant tsunamis raced outward at jetliner speeds. Some waves reached heights of up to 30 meters. Entire coastal towns like Banda Aceh were wiped out in minutes. Tourists on the beaches of Thailand and Sri Lanka were caught off guard with no sirens, no warnings. The destruction spread across 14 countries. Nearly 230,000 people were killed, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. Millions more were displaced. Survivors described scenes of horror. Streets were filled with wrecked cars, shattered buildings, and bodies. Rescue teams struggled to reach the hardest-hit areas. Remote areas were unreachable for days, communication lines were down, and hospitals were overwhelmed. The disaster also caused major ecological damage. Coral reefs, mangroves, and coastal ecosystems were destroyed. The Indian Ocean tsunami left deep scars that could not be erased. In the years that followed, survivors had to rebuild not just homes, but entire towns from scratch. Many people never found the remains of their loved ones. The memory of that morning remains an unforgettable and haunting shadow in the lives of survivors. Thank you very much for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.